What is up, Kinetic Chess Masters? We're removed from UFC Fight Night London. Going to break down the reactions to the card, stock report, who's up, who's down, where they go from here, and final thoughts. The biggest winners of this card were, of course, Sean Brady, absolutely dominating Leon Edwards. Following behind him is Bilal Muhammad, who has clearly been vindicated since he stomped both guys in the main event. And number 3, honestly, was Dustin Poirier, who didn't even fight on the card, but there's so many guys shooting that gilly that he must have been just dying to not be a part of it. Honestly, I would do the normal stock report where I go through every fight and match them up, but honestly, outside of the top 4 fights on the main card, 2 out of the rest of the fight card had more than 4 fights in the UFC. So it's kind of pointless to go through and see how far up they can go, as it's so soon for all of them. What's scary going through this is that it's one title fight away from being a pay-per-view card, but I'll get into that with the post-report analysis. So I'll start with the most important fight, obviously the main event. Sean Brady up. If you're going to put stock into a fighter, this is your guy. He has officially arrived. He's put that fraud check by Bilal Muhammad behind him. That was not a case of him being bad. That was a case of Bilal showing everybody how good he really is, and he just dominated Leon Edwards. Right now, Bilal is matched up with JDM. As dominant as this fight was, I don't see him walking right into a title shot. Let's see him matched up with Shavkat next. Shavkat pulled out of his fight with Bilal, and his fight with Ian Gary left so much to be desired. He needs one more fight to earn that back. He's in an Arman Saryukian position where he's right there, but he just lost that luster. Him versus Sean Brady for that #1 Contenders fight is perfect timing, right as Bilal gets past JDM or however that fight goes. Meanwhile, Edwards, dear God, what happened to my boy? Dear God, what happened to Leon? I mean, 2 fights ago, he's fighting Kamaru Usman. It looks like he's about to revolutionize takedown defense, like innovating that 2-on-1 against wrestlers, and now he can't stop a takedown. That was incredible. But I'm not ready to write him off quite yet. Not because I think he's a real title threat anymore. The reason is simply just look at the top of the welterweight division, and honestly, it's not that bad for Edwards. He's already beaten Usman twice. He dominated Covington. Burns is not the same fighter that Sean Brady is, and we saw that in their fight. I favor him again. I wouldn't favor him against JDM, Shavkat, or Buckley, but now's a perfect time for him to finally have that grudge match with Ian Gary, to finally see if he's really washed or it's a case of just Bilal and Brady are that good. Can Edwards really hang with the top guys anymore, or is Gary just going to prove that he was right all along? But I'm not ready to say Edwards is done. He's definitely got to fall out of that top 5. I wouldn't put him in Izzy fall-off territory just yet. He hasn't had that Imavov fight. He's more in the just had the Drickus fight. Up next is Blachowicz versus Olberg. Unlike some more colorful commentators, I don't see this fight as a robbery. It was a close fight. Neither guy really did much to differentiate themselves, and I think the big thing with Blachowicz is it was just his ring rust. I don't care what anybody says, it's definitely a factor, and you saw that with Gunnar Nelson too. They just could not get in gear while they were fighting guys who have been a lot more active recently. That being said, I wouldn't write Jan off quite yet. I just think he needs to get back into the cage as soon as possible. One of the older guys in the division, so he doesn't have much time, but I wouldn't have him fall too far. I'd put him up against Jamal Hill, with loser leaves the top 5 and is a fight or 2 away from the title. Carlos, on the other time, not the performance he needed to really launch himself into title contention, but a win over Jan is a win over a former champ. I'd put him against Yuri. He needs that wow factor fight to prove that he can really go toe-to-toe with these top guys. A pitter-patter against Jan is just not going to do it. But against Yuri, someone's going down in that fight. Someone's getting a highlight, and it'll be perfect timing for the result of the Pereira-Ankalaev rematch. Up next was Gunnar Nelson against Kevin Holland. Definitely the highlight of the night. Pretty much what you would expect for a fight between these two, especially Gunnar coming off 2 years absent. The rust really showed. He was just desperate to get the fight on the ground, and he didn't really do much with it. There was the submission attempt in the 3rd round, but he just was not comfortable, and Holland found his range. Not much more to say about it. Holland probably saves his job, definitely saves his ability to talk, and Gunnar doesn't get knocked out, though. The fight probably should have been stopped in that 1st round, but he probably doesn't take too much of a hit since he was coming back from such a long layoff and wasn't even ranked. For Holland, there really is no point in matchmaking him. If he was to be smart, he would look for someone like Brian Battle or Jake Matthews, some of those guys on the outer fringes, so he can try to get a highlight, or somebody that won't just squash him on top and tap him out. But knowing him, we'll probably hear in like 2 weeks that he's taken another fight at middleweight just for giggles. Gunnar, on the other hand, he definitely hasn't lost it with his top game. He needs to get more comfortable in the cage. He needs to get his feet wet against somebody who's also on a streak. I put him against Neil Magny. Both guys are on a rough streak, but they're both fringe names that could co-main or main event an Apex card or be on the main card of another fight night in a place where the UFC actually cares about making an impact, or even on the undercard of a pay-per-view. Up next, Molly McCann versus Alexia Thainara. Honestly, Alexia, despite coming in on a week's notice, gave herself, like, I don't know what the deal with that dance for like 20 minutes was about for a fighter that was just debuting after the Contender series, but she needed to do what she did. Otherwise, she would have just turned into a meme. But honestly, the less said about this fight, the better. This was about Molly McCann needing to get a win. She didn't. She retired. Her stocks bust. She knew it in the cage, and that's why she walked away. Thainara, it depends if the UFC actually wants to get serious with her or if she's going to drop down back to the undercard and work her way up. Solid performance over a veteran. And that really wraps up most of the consequential fights. It's pretty crazy. I'll go through the rest of the main card and then freestyle the rest of it. Chris Duncan had a great performance. He definitely probably made Dustin Poirier blush shooting the gilly. And unlike Dustin, he actually finished it. But that was more of a case of Jordan just having such poor fight IQ. I hope he follows through on that tattoo bet. And it's one of the guillotine choke just to remind him not to shoot on the bigger guy with a grappling advantage. But who knows? He's young. Maybe he's dumb. I don't know. Chris, if they have plans for him for the future, I'd give him Michael Johnson, a fringe name with a grappling deficiency that he can take advantage of, as well as somebody who won't lose too much stock to. Jordan, if they even plan to keep him, he's now on a 2-fight losing streak. He's undersized at lightweight and definitely needs to develop more. After that, Nathaniel Wood versus Morgan Charrier. I have no idea what their plans for Wood are. He has way too many fights in the UFC to be fighting somebody who's just finding his ground. He needs some finishing ability. He dropped Charrier and he needs to work on finishing or setting up his submissions better. Dropping Morgan and then shooting a guillotine that he wasn't going to get, which allowed him to get swept and lose his one shot at really getting a highlight and putting respect on his name. When Bisping is praising your technical abilities, that's just code for point fighter, win 3, lose 1. So it's really up to the UFC. Is he going to be an international fight night card filler, or they actually have plans for him to move up the rankings? If they do have plans for him to move up, I'd put him against Doo Ho Choi. Choi needs a highlight win, and Wood needs a name to actually start moving up. It's not perfect, but that's what we got. Probably on an international card or on a pay-per-view. Morgan, good recovery, but now at 2-2 in the organization, he needs something big. Put him against Billy Quarantillo. Both fighters on a bad streak in a loser leaves town matchup, and it'll also give Morgan some content for his YouTube channel. Jai Herbert versus Chris Padilla. Honestly, not to be cruel to either, but who actually cares? This fight was just brutal to get through. Like, Herbert is good at sitting on the outside, but he needs somebody to bring the fight to him. I even have in my notes, it's okay to be a sniper, but you actually have to land if you're going to have that style. And he just was not throwing. His next fight is going to be for his job. And Chris, same thing. He was content to stay on the outside with small blitzes here or there. And honestly, the less said about this one, the better. It's pretty crazy. I'll get into this in the conclusion, but this, like I said before, this fight was one title fight at the headliner away from being a pay-per-view, but fights like this were all over it. Meanwhile, on the fight night cards we had previously, like the one we just had, Vittori versus Delice, yeah, the main event was rough to get through, but the rest of the card was just barn burner after barn burner, and the guys went for it. They were full of finishes. Meanwhile, on the card the UFC actually cares about, because it's an international event, we just got drag after drag. Outside of a couple fights on the prelims, like Shauna Bannon's comeback armbar, Kavanaugh was decent scrap, but nothing to write home about. And the last couple fights on the main card, there really wasn't much going on in this card, which is pretty crazy. Then we get to Loner Kavanaugh. Like, now he's 3-0 in the UFC. If they want him to go somewhere, I dust off Tim Elliott. That could be an entertaining scrap. Hopefully get him a finish that he can move up the rankings with. But he really needs more experience and better fight IQ. Being able to take down, hold somebody down at flyweight is impressive. I mean, the only one really doing that consistently is Alejandro Pantoja, but he's just an anomaly in the division. But Kavanaugh's young, and they really should slow roll him. That's why I say if Tim Elliott's still fighting, dust him off and give Kavanaugh that fight. Felipe, I would have just said he's in the stay or down category, but damn, the fouls at the end, 2 illegal up kicks, fence grabs, and elbows to the spine. He needs to either learn the rule book or get back on the regional scene to figure it out. Plus, he's getting held down at flyweight. Who gets held down at flyweight unless you're fighting Alejandro? Flyweight, like the lower the division is, the less grappling there really is. But he was just willing to accept being on bottom, which just does not fly in the lower weight classes. And finally, Marcin Tybura versus Mick Parkin. I know people are going absolutely crazy that this fight was a robbery or whatever, but honestly, this is not the hill to die on with crying robbery. This was a slog to get through, 2 plotting heavyweights. Honestly, they should just split the difference between the 2 of them and fight down in the rankings. Marcin's really fought everybody, so it makes it tough to match him with somebody. My impulse would have been to put him against Spivak, but they've already fought, and it was not close, and he did not look particularly good. So I put him against Waldo Cortez Acosta, who just came off having a highlight reel knockout, and Mick, I put him against Kennedy. I put him against Kennedy, this guy, around the fringe of the top 15, with loser leaves top 15 on the line. Winner moves up, loser moves out. Heavyweight's just such a nightmare. And the rest of the fights, these fighters are pretty fresh. They really picked the regionals clean in the UK for this card. Final thoughts are that it's weird. Like I said throughout, this fight night was one title fight away from being a pay-per-view card. The UFC clearly was loading up on this fight night to appeal to the UK fans, but it just didn't show up the way the most recent fight night Apex cards have been. It's I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed that. Everyone from Bedtime to Hawani to Guru, like everyone has had their video just tearing the Apex apart. And I'll probably do a reaction to a couple of them in the future because they've made some really good points. But at least in all those cases, the fights show up. Like my favorite to point out is Manel Knop versus Asu Almabayev. Like outside of the main event, none of these had implications for the top of the card, yet all of them were absolute barn burners in the main event. Like Brundage versus Marquez, they were fighting for their job, and both of them knew it. And the fight was a 1-round slugfest. Hyder versus Gomez, they just missed out on fight of the night because Nasrat versus Esteban was such a barn burner. And this is like the most recent Apex cards. It's just full of those. Just fighters going for it in settings that just do not deserve those performances. And then you get pay-per-views like UFC 313, which, except for Gaethje, Turner, and Duffy, like what was the big highlight of the rest of the card? Carlos Leal, minus 750 favorite, stomping out Alex Morono. It's pretty crazy. But that's the stock report for UFC Fight Night, Edwards versus Brady. Brady has officially arrived. He's 1 fight away from a title. Regardless of who's holding it, he's going to be a problem. But this just begs the question that is on everyone's mind. How good is Belal Muhammad? And with that, you all on the next one. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.